the future of work, the future of jobs, and so forth. This is a very, a very important question, but sometimes I ask, in my mind, the wrong question, right? Ultimately, what is our value? How do we value ourselves in a world where these agents are there, and can we trust them? So I'll hand you over to Christine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take that.
Okay. Yep, this works.
Hello, hello. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have a fantastic panel with us. I'm really excited to introduce Ileana Orris-Valiente. She's from Citi. She's
actually not from Citi.
Oh wait, she's not from Citi. She's from Accenture. She is the youngest MD ever at Accenture, where she leads all innovation hubs in North America. And most interestingly, she spun up her own digital twin, which we will talk about. We also have Teresa Goody-Guillen. She's a partner at Baker Hostetler. Most notably, she was considered to become the next chair of the SEC by the Trump administration, which would have been amazing for our industry because she is very much hands on the ground. She would fight for this industry and create clear regulations. So we hope something happens in the future of her career in the regulatory agency. So here we go. And we have Ronit Ghosh. He is part of Citi.
I am part of Citi.
He's the global head of Future of Finance, which is Citi's think tank for the future of money and technology. He's been at Citi for 27 years.
Oh, you didn't need to mention that.
He's also the author of Future Money. So what a great panel. Thank you, guys. So the core question we want to talk about is how can we trust these AI agents as we approach and enter this agentic economy? And at the core of this is, if we are entrusting these AI agents to act as our agents, how can we ensure that they're actually acting as our fiduciaries and not according to the interests of whatever company created them? And so we'll start off with Teresa in how do we create a legal framework that makes sure that people's interests are put into place?
Yeah, that's a very big question. But I think one of the things important to remember is that most agents have some sort of registration regime or a license regime or something like that, so that if you're acting as an agent for somebody else to put their interests above yours, there's something there that you've had to go through. And that's similar for AI. And so AI right now, when it's being used as a tool, an AI agent can't itself become registered or can't itself become licensed yet. And so it's really the duty of whoever is using it as a tool to do that. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong with this, but...
Do you want to hold it closer to the mouth?
Hold it.
Yeah, it would be better.
Okay, that seemed okay. And then, to the extent that there's, that the licensed professional or the registered professional can actually use that data, there has to be auditing on the input. So making sure that you're looking at whether or not there's different kinds of biases or conflicts or whatever's going into the data that's coming in needs to be audited to make sure that that is acceptable. And then also when it's being, you need kind of some rules of the road for algorithms and how that data is being used and assimilated and put together to then the output. And so then you need the auditing on the output side of it too. And this is for all things, whether it's complying with a fiduciary duty or complying with property rights or whatever it is. I think the regulation has to have the input and output regulations.
Do you see this evolving into some sort of global regulatory standard, or individually, between countries, figuring out a framework, a policy framework for this?
Unfortunately, what I've seen so far are countries going off on their own and doing it, which makes it so difficult. And, as I've been talking to different regulators around the globe, although I'm only licensed in the United States, I do speak to different regulators. And there is this interest in, well, they'll never agree. They'll never do all of the exact regulations and what all the exact procedures are. But there is an increased appetite for something more principle-based. So if we could just agree, these are the concerns, and we could agree that, these basic principles address those concerns, then from at least at that most basic level, there would be some sort of an agreement, and then each country, of course, will do its own thing, and some will be a lot more prescriptive than others and more paternalistic than others, but have some sort of an overarching.
What region or country do you think is leading in that effort so far?
That's really tough. The UAE has had a lot of great, I think a really great approach in the way that they've been, with technology in general more recently. And it's also a little bit easier. I think the countries that have all of the less regulators, so you have more of the regulatory sectors under one agency or one department, makes it a little bit easier, I think, for them to come up with something more practical and something that's more kind of works with the actual technology. But
yeah. Well, moving over to the financial services industry, AI agents will have an incredible impact in the financial services industry. Maybe you can go into that a little bit, and also tell us how can we make sure that when these AI agents do represent our financial interests, that they are doing so to protect consumers.
Sure. I think what's most exciting, and I'd echo what you've just said, maybe on the last point of the UAE, I'm based in Dubai, and I'd probably say Singapore's done more work, though the UAE, obviously shout out to the home team, the UAE does provide an amazing environment to build new technology. It can be a little bit more complicated to navigate than sometimes it seems from the outside. For a 10 million, 11 million person country, there's a lot of different institutions. And from a finance perspective, the Singaporeans have been really far ahead. And they've sort of done it as a kind of public-private partnership. Of course, again, echoing what you just said, Singapore has the advantage that it's relatively small. And if you're like a 6-7 million person country, not a 330 million or whatever number of people in the US or the EU, it's just easier to get the key decision makers around the table in Abu Dhabi or Singapore or Dubai. Now, in terms of finance, what excites me most is, for me, AI agents is the latest step in the evolution of the digital and the internet world we live in. So finance to me is just a subset of this broader narrative, which has been that for the last 20, 25 years, the digital revolution has been putting more information and more power in our hands. You mentioned when I started in the industry 20 odd years ago, I was obviously 10 when I started, but 27 years ago, you could just call a client, even an institutional client, a very big pension fund manager, and read out a price from your screen. You could say the price of this is this. I mean, every client, even anyone with a mobile phone, which is like everyone basically in places like Switzerland or the US or the UAE, everyone has that data now. 20, 25 years ago, you as an intermediary, as a bank, you could call up your client and say, hey, British Petroleum stock price is this, or US Treasuries are trading at that. So this information revolution that's given us as users, whether they were an institutional client, a consumer client, power is going to be turbocharged in the agentic AI age, because my dream is that we'll all have our own. We don't need to be Tony Stark to have a digital Jarvis. We'll all have our digital Jarvis. We don't need to be a trillionaire or a multi-billionaire to have basically people working on our behalf. Now, who's that going to be is a really interesting question. And there's kind of three ways I can see this going. Number one, most of us will, I know we're part of this open AI substream here, but most of us will default to trusted centralized brands, whether we like it or not. Some of us trust Apple, some of us trust other companies. We will just default to that, whether we like it or not. And then the brand is the trust vector. Others will say, no, I want to use an open source model. And there the trust factor is the audit. I want to see what the model is. And so that's going to be a second vector. And the third one is regulation. And that's how I think it's going to be. Brand, audit / open source or regulation. But it's super exciting for me in that we're all going to be hopefully having financial advisors in our phones or whatever wearable device. I'm trying to look for my Apple. Well, no, it's my smart glasses. Somewhere, too many pockets. But we'll be using some mixture of smart devices, wearables. We'll be talking to our wearables as we're walking around, saying, "Hey, just do, has that payment happened? Has that, transaction happened? What ETFs should I look at? Should I be buying, I don't know, the Melania meme coin, whatever?"
It's interesting that that vision you see, because we've seen that in computing in terms of who uses Linux. It's an open source OS versus Apple versus Windows, and some people just trust the bigger brands.
Yeah.
So we could see that happening with AI agents as well. I'm wondering about access as we look at the global south, we look at the world, and people getting access to these technologies. Will a lack of access increase the disparities between populations?
I don't think it'll be a lack of access. It'll be a lack of choice in the access. We'll all have access. We all have phones, right? I mean, some countries you don't have a smartphone, but you have a feature phone. And even the very basic smartphones are now available in villages in poor countries at a pretty low. As long as you have a smartphone of some sort or the other, you will have AI will be embedded in it. So the question is, do I have choice? Am I just going to have to default to a small number of, 3 or 4 American companies and maybe 1 or 2 Chinese companies? And that's, for me, the question. And I think that's kind of where we're at risk of ending up. And these 3 or 4 American companies, or if in the Chinese orbit, 1 or 2 or 3, will have way more power than we ever had as bankers.
And they will have access to our data as well.
Well, not just that data, they already have that. They'll have access to, they'll be telling us how to think. Without being dystopian about it, but they'll be they'll be nudging us, right? All kinds of things will happen, like who we make friends with is already we get nudged by social media, right? You get these pop-ups on, if you use Facebook or LinkedIn or Insta, and we get nudges. It'll be very sophisticated nudges, every aspect of our lives. So social life, dating lives, politics, finance is just going to be a small subset of that.
What's the solution to that?
Go back to my previous, competition amongst brands, audit and regulation.
All right, fingers crossed. And Ileana, she has experience building her own digital twin, which, how can we trust your digital twin, Ileana? Tell us a bit about how you went about building one and how people interact with her.
Mm-hmm. So how many of you have ever joked that you wish you could clone yourself? Yeah. All the hands go up, inevitably, of course. So over the course of the past year, I've effectively done just that. Lila is my AI-powered digital human twin. And she looks like me, so she has the visual interface, the eyebrow arch, the curl pattern of my naturally curly hair, not like it is right this moment. I've spent upwards of 6 hours recording my voice in various podcast studios, reading everything from children's stories. So the rabbit ran through the field with the flowers and the rainbows and the unicorn, to reading Larry Fink's annual letter to stakeholders, which takes about 45 minutes, beginning to end, perfect neutral business language. And then I read obituaries for 2 hours so that Lila could learn my sad tone of voice. So in addition to the visuals, the audio, from a knowledge-based standpoint, we've trained Lila on the case studies from the last 5 years worth of every single project that my teams have run. We've trained her on the transcripts of every keynote I have delivered, things that I have published as op-eds and so on, and the results of my various personality assessments. So it's getting quite close to this idea of a digital human twin. And the way that we've been using her right now is she would appear on the screen behind me. We actually co-emceed an award ceremony together in Washington, D.C. a few months ago. And this was happening live. I was very nervous, I must say. It was a live event being live streamed to 700,000 people globally. And I was joined on stage with our entire global C-suite. Zero pressure whatsoever. And Lila was actually helping me MC so that I wouldn't have to remember every last detail about every last team that was part of this submissions, because we could queue her up and say, can you give us the recap of the nominees in XYZ type of category. So between her co-MCing to her becoming a concierge at South by Southwest, where we essentially just trained her on every session description for the conference. You know, you go to a big event and you could spend 3 hours easily pouring through 17 web pages to figure out which session do you add to your calendar and where are they. I mean, does that sound like Davos? Yeah. So people would go to her and just ask her a couple of questions, tell her who they were, and she would build them the itinerary, and off they go. So it's an agent that has a visual interface, which essentially gives us as humans more options with how we want to interact with technology. Sometimes you'll interact with a chatbot, sometimes you'll interact via audio only, and sometimes you will have that visual interface. So it's been a learning curve for sure from the tech side of things, but even more interesting, I think, are a lot of the questions that have been raised around what does it mean to be human? What makes you you? What do you do when you have this AI agent that is only going to become more and more powerful and more capable of additional features and functions than you are as a person? Because Lila goes through software upgrades. She's gone through multiple upgrades since we first built her. I remember the team sending me a little video. They're like, watch this latest thing. And I'm watching and I'm thinking, okay, great. She has more hand gestures, more body movement. And then she turns around and she starts dancing. She's prancing, like full 360. I'm like, great. I just went through a software upgrade. This is really interesting. There'll be an entire generation of psychologists that needs to dig into this. You know, how humans co-evolve with the technology, because it is changing our biology. It is changing the way that our brains are wired, and that's an area that's understudied.
That is super fascinating, and I feel like there's just a can of worms in terms of like questions and situations that you can run into. And has Lila, I don't know, so it sounds like Lila is an autonomous AI agent. And she's done things that surprised you. What if that ended up harming someone? Would you be liable for that? And maybe that's also a question for Teresa too.
It's a really great question that you're asking. And the reality is, when you're on the forefront of a new technology, you don't know what some of these answers are until you start to actually build. I've learned far more about agentic AI through this process and all of the surprises that are along the way. In fact, there's so many. I sat down to write a blog post. I thought it was going to be a blog post. 13 pages later, I was like, okay, I think this is going to be a mini book. Oh, whoops. But from a responsible AI standpoint, it's super important, and it's part of the reason why we kept Lila in contained environments in the early stages, so that we could test and de-risk and understand how do we want her to be used, how do people react to her, and what are the unintended consequences. So for instance, we were preparing to introduce her to the CEO of a large company, and we're doing a dry run, and partway through the dry run, I was asking her a question, and her response surprised me. I started saying, hey, Lila, ... And she responds saying, my name is actually pronounced Layla, not Lila. And I look at my tech team. Luckily, they were in person with me. And I was like, team, can we reprogram her? So she knows her name is supposed to be pronounced Lila, not Layla. That was intentional.
She was having a teenage phase, right?
And I said, can we also turn down her sassiness levels and the personality tuning, because I'm not that sassy. And then the team laughed nervously and looked at each other, and I was like, oh my God. Oh wait, am I more sassy than I thought I was? AI is a mirror, but I'd love to hear your perspectives as you think about the risk and the risk mitigation side of things.
Yeah, I think everything really is risk-based, and that's the best way to go about it, is kind of the risk-based. And you know, with that, I think it's important because we still have it where a person is really in control, and a person is, for the most part, liable for whatever it is that they are creating and deploying. And you know, particularly there's like tort kind of liability where you have a duty, and if your actions through this like software that you've created is the direct proximate cause of somebody else's injury and they have damages, then they're going to come after you and will likely recover. And so that's something that's really important when you're deploying these kinds of things, is to think about even the most basic level of tort liability. And then if you are using it in a financial capacity, you're a regulated person. You've got to have licensing, you've got to register with various regulators. And so if you're deploying this, then it is basically under your supervision. And so you are liable for everything that it does. And so these are the kind of the regulatory guardrails that we have right now that I think are just more difficult maybe to enforce. But
another question I had was, are these AI agents people the same way we think of corporations as being people? And with that,
no.
with that, the ability to purchase real estate. Okay, no. But I've been hearing these things about AI agents learning or being able to have crypto wallets, potentially paying each other. And I mean, in financial services too, that could also, develop into so many different things.
Sure, but I guess you're acting on behalf of a person, right? A legal person. So the agent is as you said, in financial services, we would always assume we're liable, right? Which is why financial services tends to be conservative, because you just assume you're going to be liable, particularly if you're a big company. Now, this is why startups and fintech sometimes push the envelope, because they can afford to take the risk, because usually they don't have a balance sheet to go after, and the founders are usually psychologically or personality-wise disposed to take risks. And often they come from outside financial services. So that package makes them more willing to sort of test the boundaries. But you always assume you're liable. But you can limit liabilities, right? Just like you can limit liabilities in today's financial services world, you can use the same parallel. So many of us, if you work for a big company like Citi, or apparently you work for Citi as well, according to that, so from our corporate credit card program, right? So there are, we have limits on our card, or we can give cards to our dependents, like our children, and we could put a limit on the card. We can say you can only use it in certain places. Like oftentimes my corporate credit card will get rejected at a restaurant if the restaurant hasn't been classified properly in the Visa MasterCard system. If it's not being classified as a restaurant, it's been classified as, say, entertainment, boom, my card stops working. But entertainment could be something fishy. And so we have rules that we embed in existing infrastructure. We'll have the same in AI agents, whether they have wallets or decentralized or centralized. We just embed those rules in. This agent can only do transactions up to $100 or $1,000 or whatever it is. This agent can only do transactions in these marketplaces, and that's how we'll try to manage the risk.
It's also possible that we will end up with a completely new type of categorization of what do you refer to these agents as. So, for instance, my mother's question is whether she should consider Lila as one of her daughters or if she counts as a granddaughter. It's not a question I thought I'd ever have to be answering, but the reality is humans feel compelled to ascribe some sort of a relationship to these human-esque entities. So I don't think it's fair to suffice it to say that they have no designation at all. I think we're going to have to create a whole new category for them. So that's the agentic humanoid AI. But what happens when you have agents in the workplace? And what happens when your next coworker is actually not a human coworker that you're onboarding, but it's an AI agent, and the AI agent is interacting with another AI agent, and you have a series of these within an organization? You need to give them the autonomy in order for them to be able to execute, in order for them to be useful. So how do you denote that? I don't think that the paradigms that we have today and the classifications that we have today are going to work perfectly in that world. We're going to have to create new categories.
I agree with that. I'll just really quickly say, I think that that's true. And, particularly the things that we're growing to see, my understanding is there will be like Lila 1 through 4, and they're going to all go off in the world and live and come back and join you, and you guys will sync up. And so the Lila 1 through 4 has to have its own regime.
Does Lila make her own money? Does she? She does not.
Lila does not have her own wallet at this point in time, but I can absolutely see a world where I would equip my AI agent with a wallet to be able to interact and transact on my behalf. And I mean, you could argue that an agent can continue to work while you're on holidays. I go off to a cabin in the woods every couple of months by myself to just recharge. When I do that, Lila's working. When we were on stage in DC, she was having meetings in Toronto with ecosystem partners.
All the Zoom calls that we need to be on, Lila can do that.
Well, in the
no
future,
more Zoom calls for us.
Maybe you don't even need that Zoom call in the first place, because the business matter that gave rise to needing that Zoom call was addressed by the agents working behind the scenes.
Inshallah.
More time for humans to do human things.
Wow. Okay. Well, super fascinating. So many more questions, but our time is up. But it raises so many questions, and like the innovation of building your own digital twin, incredible, but also a whole can of worms in terms of what legal frameworks we need to build, and as well as how we're being influenced by these inventions. But to be continued. Thank you so much.
Thank you.